Class, there are also lines of questioning in interviews that are very common and yet also not very productive. I think the most benign version of this are questions like, tell me a bit about yourself, or why do you want to work here? These are questions that are basically warm up softball questions. Interviewees expect these questions when they rock up to interviews, and so yeah, you may as well ask them. They don't serve much of a function for selection purposes, though. Then there are questions like, if you were a type of rock, what type would it be? As if knowing that I would be more of a pumice because I float on water, as if that really says anything about whether or not I can do the job. I think the thinking behind some of these questions is, can you think on your feet? But yeah, is that a KSAO? And if that were a KSAO, is this the right way to measure it? Yeah. And then there are questions like, where do you see yourself 10 years from now, that are often asked in jobs where that's not really relevant, in which the average tenure certainly isn't 10 years, yeah, not realistically. And I mean, what does this really tell you with regard to KSAOs? Yeah, what does this tell you about whether or not the person can do the job? Yeah, or whether or not they would stay. Interviewers are typically unprepared and they make very quick judgments of the candidate. Yeah, so let's go through some examples. This is a poll run by HRMT, the Society for Human Resource Management. This is the equivalent to ARI in the US, so this is the main HR professional body in America. And so ask the question, how long does it take to make the not to hire decision? When you meet a job candidate, you'll notice that um, a reasonable fraction make the decision under 1 minute. Yeah, the modal response seems to be about 15 minutes and they decide, oh well, we're not going to hire this person. Bearing in mind that the answer best supported by the evidence is not applicable. I usually don't make the not to hire decision during the interview. Yeah, if you're making the yes no decision on the fly in the interview, you have done something wrong. Yeah, something has gone wrong in your screening process, or you maybe don't quite know what you want and are making quick judgment calls. Which is, by the way, very, very common. I've conducted interviews myself without really knowing what I want, and I've kind of had to stop myself and go, oh, I'm not doing this right. This is, of course, before I was trained in staffing. Now, class, which of the following behaviors are deal breakers? Yeah, during the interview process, is dressed too provocatively. Yeah, grammatical errors, late for the interview, talks negatively about a previous supervisor. These are also somewhat of a problem. Yeah, talks negatively about previous experiences. Even a cell phone ring, class. Forgetting to switch your phone to silent mode can be a problem to of the half of the people who were surveyed here. And being dressed too casually shows up again. Class, ask yourself, are these things KSAOs? Are these indicative of the knowledge, skills, abilities, and other characteristics needed to do the job well? Yeah? If they're relevant, it's useful to specify how exactly they're relevant. Yeah, maybe a strong sense of professionalism is something that is absolutely pertinent to doing the job well, then it should be a KSAO. And maybe you may want to tap it in a way that is much more precise as a measurement tool than simply waiting for the candidate to slip up and, I don't know, have their phone ring during the interview, as if that tells you anything of any real value. Yeah. And then you see here we have more. Importantly, class, see here that having a rather unprofessional email handle can come off in a negative way. Yeah, but not a lot of issues about asking about work hours or missing a thank you note. These are generally fine. And of course, nobody likes a name dropper. Class, what exactly do interviews measure? Yeah, because if you think about what I just described here, yeah, and if you think about what HR professionals are claiming to do here, 80% of them, uh, it and the interview doesn't seem to be measuring anything. Yeah, it's kind of just a conversation that's like, on some level, even a nice break for the person conducting the interview. It's a break from doing some tedious other task. Yeah, and so they get to have this conversation and be in a position of power over this hapless job candidate. Yeah. Now, for us to understand what an interview is meant to do in selection class, let's revisit our reliability and validity. Now, quick recap, class. From week 3, reliability is it consistent? So, is how well you do in an interview going to be roughly the same if you did the interview now or 2 weeks later or a month later? Ideally, yes. A good interview will elicit the same types of responses, the same quality of responses over time. Yeah, it will elicit responses that are equally interpreted by the various panelists. Yeah, so panelists should agree on what a good response is. Yeah, and the responses should capture the knowledge, skills, and abilities needed to carry out the job well. It should be valid, class, and it should predict the outcomes that matter for work. Now, class, what we find is that panel interviews and structured interviews tend to be more reliable. Yeah, so here we have the inter-rater reliability. So generally, people in structured interviews tend to do approximately just as well when given the same interview later on. Yeah. Now, class, interviews tend to be valid, yeah, when the interviewers don't have access to a lot of other information. Basically, you actually want to go in without knowing that much, asking the same sorts of questions repeatedly. So you want to be less informed by other things and coming in more as a blank slate. Yeah, behavioral interviews tend to predict job behavior more than situational interviews for reasons that will be clear when we talk about behavioral and situational interviews. Yeah. Now, the use of bars makes a world of difference, class, for validity. Basically, bars are a way of scoring interview responses in ways that are behaviorally anchored. So you know what a good response and a bad response is, and you can kind of place each response in that continuum, or rather along that continuum. And of course, interview training and interview consistency also makes a difference, class. So these are the things that make interviews much more likely to predict performance. Because again, that's what you want, yeah? An interview that does not measure anything, that does not predict performance, is a waste of everyone's time and a waste of the organization's money, and is likely to choose people that don't generate value for the firm. Yeah? Now, class, the type of interview that I have discussed primarily so far is the unstructured interview. So this is the what interviews are generally like, sadly, often. These are interviews where the questions are not there's no clear set of questions. The goal is not to rate people on specific knowledge, skills, and abilities, but rather to make a global assessment of, is this a good candidate or not? Yeah, these are very, very vague, class. Yeah, and will tend to be a general chat about the job, the background of the candidate, their hobbies. It is tailored often to the candidate, which seems like it should be good, but is not. Class, the validity coefficients for unstructured interviews are low. How low? 0.2. Now remember, class, yeah, how much of the between person difference in performance then is captured by unstructured interviews? Yeah, 0.2 squared is 4%. So an unstructured interview, how well you do on that relates to 4% of job performance, which is really not much. Not much. Now, are these unstructured interviews worth doing at all? No, class. Interviewers tend to be very inconsistent. Yeah, they don't ask the same questions to each job candidate, or multiple interviewers will ask different sorts of questions. Yeah, interviewers are very easily biased. Yeah, so they tend to be swayed a lot by various other characteristics. Yeah, like how well they're dressed, for example. These things can bias interviewers. First impressions matter more than they should. Yeah, if you think about it, the first impression should not matter as much for doing the job because the person is doing the job over a protracted span of time. But you're making an impression that is overly reliant on a very brief interaction because the interview is so unstructured, it's so vague that really the thing that sticks out most is your almost emotional response to what is going on. And lastly, negative information tends to stick out much more in unstructured interviews. And really, HR professionals have said very explicitly that unstructured interviews tend to be fact-finding investigations into reasons not to hire a person. Yeah, it's emblematic of everything bad about a failed selection process. Yeah, and so the solution for this is to create some structure in the interviews. Yeah, so we know that interview structure shows pretty good criterion validity, which is to say predicting outcomes like performance, teamwork, etc. Yeah, uh, any interview can be enhanced by introducing structure to some components, yeah, of the interview. There are numerous components of interviews that can be rendered more structured, and there are 15 of these. Yeah, so first is basing the interview on job analysis. Yeah, asking everyone the same questions. Prompts and follow-up questions, probing questions should generally be limited. Yeah, and so there's a lot of these that you can go through, class. There are multiple ways that you can make interviews more structured. Some things that really stand out, class, are asking the same questions, limiting the number of prompts, yeah, using the same interviewers, using multiple interviewers like a panel, class, yeah, using bars, using multiple dimensions, which is to say that your interview should measure more than one thing. The goal is not to come up with some global evaluation, but to measure KSAOs of interest, yeah, and to do so systematically. And importantly, to train interviewers. Now, class, interviews should be scored should be scored arithmetically. Arithmetically, it should be scored. Class, the interview should leave you with some sort of numerical rating of the job candidate. Yeah, it is not merely a kind of global sense or even a gut feel, emotional sense of how good this candidate is, because those tend not to predict performance. And we'll cover the role of numbers in much more detail in selection decision making. Yeah, so class, you can take these 15 ways in which they're structured interviews and collapse them into 4 general degrees of how structured an interview is. From as low as no structure, in which an interview asks whatever they like, a higher level in which there is at least an outline of topics to cover, yeah, a third type in which it is looking a little more rigid, yeah, it's the same sets of questions but with slight opportunity for tailoring. And lastly, the highest level is asking the exact same questions in the exact same way and exact same order. As we will discuss later in the lecture class, the higher the level of structure, by and large, the more valid the interview is, the more it predicts performance. Again, class, we are not like conducting structured interviews is not fun for the interviewer. It's not fun, but it's not supposed to be fun. Yeah, it's supposed to measure a knowledge, skill, or ability of the job candidate and do so in the service of predicting criteria that matter, predicting performance, predicting teamwork, etc., etc., class. Now, which of these KSAOs would be best assessed using interviews? Now, this is not altogether too difficult, class. Yeah, so physical ability and cognitive ability are best captured by your cognitive ability tests. Yeah, covered in week 4. Personality best captured with the inventories we discussed in week 5. You can use interviews to assess personality. It's not the most apt use of interviews, but it can be used to that end. But generally, it is useful for KSAOs that are pertinent to decision making, yeah, to judgment. Now, class, interviews should be tailored to the job. You wouldn't be asking the same questions for every job, and the interviews should measure relevant KSAOs. Yeah. Now, it should not measure too many things. Interviews are not meant to stand alone, which is to say they should be complemented by other techniques. If you want to get cognitive ability, perhaps you want a cognitive ability test. Yeah. Um, However, there are other bits here that are nicely suited to interviews. Yeah, things like social skills show up nicely in interviews. Job knowledge can be captured in cognitive ability tests, but interviews are also very good for tapping job knowledge. Now, broadly speaking, interviews are best for things like social skills, organizational citizenship, going the extra mile, job knowledge, and discretionary judgment or decision making. Now, interviews, when structured, class, tend to have lower adverse impact than people expect. So there's some minimal adverse impact, but it is not as strong if it is a structured interview. So structured interviews tend to be pretty good at giving about the same result for people across their demographic category and is uh, more fair to protected groups. Now, class, naturally, the score that you get from an interview will be contaminated by things that can lower the validity. Yeah. So if the interviewer likes the job candidate, sees themselves as similar to the job candidate, yeah. Generally, their judgment of the job candidate, which can be influenced by loads of things, class, these things generally detract from the usefulness of interviews and make them less valid, although some have argued that these things also capture information that is relevant to whether or not they can perform the job well. But broadly speaking, you want to structure your interviews to minimize the contamination of your interview scores. And lastly, we will end with a video below, which is part of a video series called More Than a Gut Feeling, which sort of lays out the HR case for structured interviews. That's it for now, class. More next on the actual practice of interviewing.